Welcome to the Queen Mary Intellectual Property Research Institute lecture to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the Centre for Commercial Law Studies. And thank you for everyone for joining us today. As you will be aware, this year marks the 40th anniversary of the Centre for Commercial Law Studies. And during the last 40 years, many thousands of postgraduate and research students from around the world have passed through CCLS and have now gone on to achieve great success in their careers. And in many ways, our alumni, many of you who are here today, are our ambassadors, and it's your growing reputations as lawyers and academics that enhances further the reputation of CCLS. CCLS this year was ranked among the top 30 universities worldwide. And nowhere is the reputation of the Centre for Commercial Law Studies stronger than in the field of intellectual property. Within the Queen Mary Intellectual Property Research Institute, we have the largest concentration of full-time faculty members in intellectual property anywhere in Europe. The Centre for Commercial Law Studies also hosts the Queen Mary Intellectual Property Archive, and in addition, the Queen Mary Journal of Intellectual Property, founded under the editorship of my colleague, Professor Johanna Gibson, and its consultant editor, Lord Hoffman. It wouldn't be complete to have an event like this without acknowledging the role of my predecessor in this job as director of the Queen Mary Intellectual Property Research Institute, without mentioning Professor Gibson, and also our great benefactor, Herschel Smith, whose bequest and generosity for IP scholarship at the Centre for Commercial Law Studies made all of this possible. Of course, it's also true to say that none of this at CCLS would be possible without you, our alumni. And so on behalf of myself, Duncan Matthews, and my Deputy Director at the Queen Mary Intellectual Property Research Institute, Professor Uma Suthersanan, I'd like to welcome you all today. And at this point, I'm going to prepare to hand over to my co-panelists, Dr. Noam Shemtov, who is a reader in intellectual property law and technology here in the Intellectual Property Research Institute, and also an alumni of CCLS, an alumna, and also Gadi Oron, who's the director of CISAC, that's the International Confederation of Societies of Authors and Composers, who is also a visiting professor in the Queen Mary Intellectual Property Research Institute, and also an alumnus of CCLS. So just a last point about how you can submit questions to our panelists today. Noam Shemtov is going to be moderating the discussion after Gadi Oron gives his presentation. You can either submit questions using the chat function on Zoom, including everybody in your discussion, or you can submit those questions only to Noam Shemtov, and he can then present those questions directly to our speaker, Gadi Oron. And if you could try and submit those questions within the first 30 minutes of Gadi Oron's presentation, that will give Noam time to gather those questions up and to present them to our speaker today. So the format is that I'll now hand over to Noam, then Gadi will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a moderated discussion between Noam and Gadi, and I hope you enjoy the event. And again, thank you for joining us. Noam, over to you.
Thank you, Duncan, for the kind introduction. Actually, I have very little to say at this point. I'm going to hand it over to Gadi straight away for his talk. I'll say thank you, everyone, for joining us. I have a feeling that we are up for a treat. After Gadi's presentation, I will pose a number of questions to Gadi that would be then followed by questions from the audience, as Duncan explained, should be, just for the sake of convenience, channeled through me. But that's about it for now. So without further ado, Gadi, please, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Duncan and Noam. Very happy to be here, and I would like to thank everyone who joined us. I'm honored to be the speaker at this special event to mark the 40th anniversary of the Center for Commercial Law Studies. And certainly when I enrolled on the LLM program, it was, I think, about 20 years ago, I certainly did not imagine that one day I will be invited to represent the Institute in these celebrations. So I'm truly honored and truly proud to give this lecture today. So let me share with you my, my screen. And okay, so the presentation I'm going to deliver is focusing on the collective management of rights. And I think that many of you will know that this is an area of copyright law that is actually on the intersection between copyright, contract, and competition laws. And I have to admit, it's quite strange to deliver a sort of a speech or a lecture in front of a screen. And when I've accepted the invitation to give this lecture, I certainly had a slightly different picture in mind about how this event would look like. But of course, life has changed for all of us. And I guess that like many of you, I'm spending most of my days in video conferences. And so I felt that given this new format for the event, sharing thoughts is probably more suitable than a formal lecture or a formal presentation. So I would like to share with you my thoughts. And these are my thoughts. These are not CISAC's thoughts. The opinions are my opinions. This is not a lecture that I'm delivering on behalf of CISAC, and it does not necessarily represent the interests of CISAC or the positions of CISAC. And I think it's important to emphasize that these are my views. And in my view, the creative industries are now at a pivotal point in their development. The landscape is changing. It is changing quite rapidly. The creative sector is constantly adapting to this changing environment. But how we adapt and how the decisions that we take today will affect our future, these are things that must be guided, I think, not only by an understanding of what is happening today, but we must also understand, and we should learn lessons from the past. And I think that when it comes to how the creative industries transformed in the past, there's a lot to learn. And the past can teach us a lot about transformations in the creative sector. And this is what I would like to focus on. And this is why I chose the title, Reflections on the Future, Lessons from the Past. I would like to talk about the future, but in the context of the past and how we've reacted in the past and how that could affect our future. And I would like to start with a few words about intermediaries. But I would like to talk about intermediaries of this type, theaters. When we say today the word intermediaries, we immediately think of technology companies or digital platforms like Google, Facebook, YouTube, and many others. But 200 years ago, these were the intermediaries, theaters. And when the creators of that period, the creators of that time talked about theaters, they've used the exact same word that we use today. They called them intermediaries. They were the intermediaries who gave access to dramatic works. And thanks to these intermediaries, or I should probably say because of these intermediaries, we saw two key themes that emerged in the creative sector. The first one is cooperation, and the second one is exchange of information. And the main thought I would like to share with you today is that in the past 10 or 15 years, we started to see major changes in these two themes or in these two elements. And these changes are happening in a way that could eventually have a negative impact on culture and on cultural diversity. But before I go into that, let me take a few steps back and start with a quick overview about our industries, about the creative industries. So the creative industry is the music industry, the audiovisual industry with the film and TV sectors, the visual arts, performing arts, literature, book publishing, all of the others. They are all hugely important economic sectors. And there are different studies about the size of these industries. On the screen, you see a few figures. These are figures that Ernst & Young, or EY, as they call themselves today, they've reached these figures in a study that we commissioned at CISAC and we published with UNESCO. That was a couple of years ago. These figures are probably a little bit outdated, and it's also important to remember that the size of the creative industries very much depends on how you define them and which sectors you include in this definition. But what is clear and what's important to remember is that these industries, in addition to their immense contribution to the economy, they also play another very important and even a crucial role. They create our culture. They define our cultural identity. They contribute to cultural diversity. And they create today what will become our cultural heritage. At the heart of this sector or these industries are individuals, individual creators, the music composer, the lyricist, the playwright, the screenwriter, the film director, the painter, the book author, and many, many others. And everything else is built around them. Everything else is built around these individuals and would not exist without them. The huge film studios, the record companies, the book publishers, the auction houses, galleries, museums, nothing will exist without these individuals or these creators. And these creators discovered that when it comes to protecting their interests, working together was much more effective than working alone. And they've realized, and it was in the 18th century, that they must unite and they must coordinate to protect their rights, because as individuals, they have very little power and they have very little influence. And the structures they've built in order to facilitate the cooperation between them are authors' societies, or as they are sometimes referred to, collective management organizations. The essential functions of these societies is to manage authors' or creators' rights, and by managing the rights of individual authors, these societies allow the creators to focus on their art. And then, when the creators focus on their art, and they can make a living from their art, they continue to enrich society, both culturally and economically. And this system, the collective management of system, also brings economies of scale, because societies are managing together the rights of many authors, and therefore they reduce administrative costs and also reduce the burden for both the authors and those who seek licenses to use works. Now, today we are more than 2 centuries after the establishment of the collective management system, and this system, I think, continues to play an indispensable role for both the users of creative works and the creators. But when we think about the importance of collective management in supporting culture, and this is the main theme of my presentation, if we think about the role and the importance of these entities in supporting culture, we need to think about the 2 qualities or the 2 elements that I mentioned earlier: cooperation and data. So first, cooperation. Solidarity and unity and cooperation, these are elements that have kept the industry together, I think. And they've brought collective strength, and of course, collective bargaining power. They brought efficiencies. They brought the economies of scale that I mentioned. But today we see major changes and major challenges in this area. And I think that it is important to be aware of these challenges, and to make sure that the cooperation and the benefits that cooperation brings continue to exist. And the second theme is, and that I would like to mention, is data and exchange of information. The processing and the management of data has always been, I would say, a defining feature of the collective management system. But today, it is more important than it ever was. And these two themes, cooperation and exchange of data, they really come together in the context of the changes that we've seen in the last 10 or 20 years, and all of these changes that were brought by digital technologies. Because digital technologies have forced the creative industries to transform. They forced the creative industries to adapt. But this phenomenon that technologies force the creative industries to adapt, this is nothing new. It happened many times in the past. And the question is not whether the industries will change, because they will. They have no choice if they want to survive. And in fact, they've already changed quite a lot in the last 10 or 15 years. The real question is how the industries will change and how successfully they will transform to the new reality, to the new market reality. And the question that is related to that, which I think is no less important, is how this transformation of the creative industries will affect our culture in the future. How our culture will change because of the way the industry is transformed today. So I said that in the context of the history of the creative industries, adaptation and transformation is not new. In fact, throughout history, the creative industries have had to adapt. They had to adapt to new technologies, and they had to reinvent their business models. In fact, when you think about it, large parts of the creative industries of today were actually built on the backbone of new technology. We would not have the successful film industry that we have today if we didn't have, at the end of the 19th century, what was back then the new technology of motion pictures. We would not have the successful music industry of today without the invention of the phonograph and the Edison cylinders, those funny looking round sound recordings from the 1880s. So it's always been the case that creators had to adjust. They had to adjust to the ability to record sounds, to the invention of broadcasting by Marconi, to home taping, and later to home video, and most recently to digital. In a historical context, digital technology is just one more technology that the creative industries have to learn to live with. But referring to the two, going back to the two key themes that I mentioned earlier as themes that underpin collective management, cooperation and data, I think digital has changed quite a lot in this context. It has changed the nature of cooperation in our sector, and it has changed the way we value, the way we use, and the way we exchange data. So, cooperation. Digital has changed the relationships within the creative sector, and specifically within collective management of rights. The unanimity of interests that was there before is no longer there in the way that it used to. Because of the digital revolution, and also because of policies that have been adopted in many countries around the world to promote competition in the collective management sector, the interests of key players to work together collectively are diminishing. And this could have a negative impact on our culture in the long run, in my view. Data is hugely important, and it is probably more important than ever, but one of the main challenges today has to do with how data is used. How data is used and how it is shared is a key issue today, because if data is not used, if it is not used efficiently, or if it is monopolized, this could undermine the interests of society in creative activity. The more valuable data becomes, the less incentives there are to share it. And this is something that I think is in contradiction to what we've had before the digital revolution. The world of collective management has always relied on exchanges of data and on efficient exchanges of data about who owns what and which repertoire was used and where. But today, the data on who owns what content was used, this data has a value in its own. And because of the nature of competition in the market, there are reduced incentives to share this data. And I think that this is something that is somewhat paradoxical, I would say. It is paradoxical that it is easier and faster and cheaper to exchange data today, but at the same time, there's less and less interest to do it. And this is another thing that we need to be aware of if we are conscious about the well-functioning and the future development of the cultural sector. So these are the two things I would like to focus on, and I would like to dive into these issues and look at each one of them more closely. And I would like to start with cooperation in the creative sector. And I would like to start with a look at the past. And that's because the past puts things in a very interesting perspective. So the one strong lesson I think we can learn from the past is that creators have always faced the same challenge. And that challenge is dealing with powerful commercial entities who exploit creative works. Whether it was theater owners, broadcasters, or today internet platforms, there's always been an imbalance between the creators on one hand and the users of their works on the other. And this imbalance of power is what gave birth to the idea of creators joining forces. Collective management of copyright was founded by playwrights. And these playwrights realized that they could obtain better conditions and a better remuneration for the use of their dramatic works when they negotiated collectively with the theater owners. So it was in a hot summer evening in July 1777, when the famous French playwright Pierre Beaumarchais, that you see on the screen, he brought together a group of 22 authors, and he urged them to discuss and to find solutions to the poor remuneration that they all received from the Théâtre Français for the use of their dramatic works. And Beaumarchais was specifically concerned and irritated that he received very low payments from the Comédie Française for the use of his one of his most famous plays, The Barber of Seville. And this action, this gathering and this action of a small group of authors eventually led to a major change. Because in 1791, France passed the first law on authors' rights. And very shortly afterwards, entities that managed these new authors' rights were created. And once this idea was established, or it has been established in the world of theater, the principles of collective management expanded to other repertoires. And there's a very interesting, very famous case about how collective management of rights started in the world of music. I assume that some of you have heard this story before. And the story goes that in 1847, the French composer Ernst Bourget visited a cafe in Paris. It was called Les Ambassadeurs. And in this cafe, live music was played. They used to call these places Café Concert because there were concerts held there. Of course, back then, if you listened to music, it was because someone was playing it next to you. There were no sound recordings back then. So it was very common for bands to play in public places like restaurants or cafes. And so Bourget was sitting with his friends in this cafe, and while he was enjoying his drink, he started hearing one of his compositions being played by the band. And he was angry that his permission had not been sought. He was angry that he was not being paid. And he was furious that he had to pay for his drink, but that the establishment didn't need to pay him anything for his music. And there are different versions for how exactly this conflict happened, but the important thing is that with a few other composers, Bourget brought a legal action against the owner of the cafe. And they've asked the court, they appealed to the French court, and they asked the court to either forbid the performance of their musical compositions, or to decide that they, the composers, should be paid for these performances. And the court found in their favor. So the principle was established that authors and composers, they had a performing right and they should be paid when their works are performed in public. But of course, having the rights is not enough, because the big question is, how do you enforce them? You have a practical problem of enforcing and monitoring and collecting your remuneration. And so the first author society was formed in France, and very quickly others followed. The next one was in Italy, later in Germany, the UK, the US, and many others. And over time, collective management was established in many countries around the world. Today, according to our records, there are no less than 239 societies that operate in 122 countries. And although these societies were established to deal primarily with royalties, they very quickly expanded their role beyond that. So today, societies are heavily involved in advocacy. They take a very active role in lobbying. They lobby for stronger copyright laws. They invest in technological tools. They invest in information systems to help them identify works and to correctly collect and distribute royalties. And they engage in many other activities, including education, awareness raising, market research, helping young creators, and also supporting the well-being of generally of their members. Actually, this is a very important point, especially today, because many author societies now have programs to support creators in need. And in the last 2 or 3 months, significant amounts were made available by societies as emergency funds to help creators in distress because of the COVID-19 crisis. But it's important to remember that all of these issues that are now mentioned on the screen, societies have been cooperating, licensing, technology, lobbying, and generally they've been cooperating on promoting culture. But as I said, the raison d'etre for collective management is the strength of the collective. It started with playwrights who wanted to negotiate better conditions. And throughout history, this element repeated itself. It repeated itself just with different users, different entities that provided access to creative works. Today, we call them intermediaries, but in fact, as I mentioned earlier, this is the same term that they've used also 100 years ago. So you can think today about the difficulties that our sector has in negotiating with the intermediaries of today, with Google, YouTube, Facebook, Amazon, but this imbalance of power between creators and intermediaries is nothing new. If you think our sector has a big struggle with intermediaries today, I would like to share a quote with you. It's a quote that I like a lot. It's a quote from Robert de Flers. He was a French playwright. He was one of CISAC's founding fathers. And de Flers called authors to join forces around a mission that he called the elimination of the intermediary. And he said, and you have the quote on the screen, "Let us unite, help each other, know each other. Let's learn in detail, in text as in practice, the functioning of the diverse societies of authors that exist all over the world. And we shall attain obligatorily, mathematically, to this result whose benefit you see, the elimination of the intermediary." I'm not talking about the honest, active, and useful intermediary. There are indeed a few, not many perhaps, but some. But of the parasitical and noxious intermediary who deprives us of the money owed to us, who deforms our works or allows it to be deformed, who debases them by programming them in theaters where they shouldn't be, and translates them in languages that are from no country at all. This intermediary gentleman, I believe, we have just been burying. It seems to me one of the most joyful funerals which I might conceivably be invited to attend. Now, this quote from the Fleurs is from 1926. It's actually from the day in which CISAC was established. But if you take this quote and put it in the context of today's copyright battles, it really gives them a fascinating historical context. If you replace the theater owners with today's intermediaries, this quote, which is almost 100 years old, it really comes to life. And what it tells us is something that we actually know today, and we understand. We understand the same thing that the creators understood more than 100 years ago. And it is that the fight for fair remuneration is ultimately a fight for fair treatment by intermediaries. And also that the individual creator cannot take on this fight alone. They need to be coordinated with others. They need to deal with this issue in a coordinated fashion. So what is the state of coordination today? I would like to share with you some figures, sort of a snapshot of collective management on behalf of authors. So today, as I mentioned, there are 239 societies. They operate in 122 countries. CISAC, the organization that I'm heading, is the international confederation of all of these author societies. And together, all of these societies represent more than 4 million creators from different disciplines of the arts. Many of them are music creators, but there are also visual artists, film, TV directors, screenwriters, playwrights, authors of literature, and many others. In 2018, which is the last year we have the figures for, all of these societies together collected 9.65 billion euros in royalties. This is just over 10 billion US dollars. And there's a growing trend in these collections, at least until the coronavirus crisis started. Another very positive trend is that digital collections, or the royalties coming from digital services, have been growing year on year. In 2018, they accounted for 17% of all the money that's collected. But until about 20 years ago, this system, or each society in this system, was focused on its own territory. Societies were predominantly focused on their domestic market. Each local society represented creators who were either residents or nationals of the same country. And also the local societies issued licenses that cover only their own territory. And then societies also signed agreements to represent other societies in their territory so that each one of them could offer licenses that cover the world repertoire for their country or in their territory. And there is a crucial aspect to that because, or in the sense that the system that we had until 20 years ago encouraged each society to take care of its local interests, to support the local creators, and to promote local culture and local repertoire. And digital technologies have really sent a shockwave to this system. They challenged this centuries-old network. The market for creative content became borderless. Digital platforms wanted licenses that cover multiple territories. They didn't want to be limited by getting licenses territory by territory. And decision makers felt that they needed to intervene. They wanted to intervene to remove barriers. As many of you will know, it happened especially in the European Union, where the single market is supposed to have free circulation of goods and services. So in the EU and in many other places, the chosen course of action was to apply competition regulation, and in order to effectively force competition among collective management entities. And the underlying assumption was that by forcing competition and by effectively putting societies against each other, the licensing landscape would become much better. So fast forward 20 years, what has changed? What do we have today? Well, the first thing I think that is clear is that digital has fundamentally changed the relationships in our sector. The old barriers that divided different players in the industry before are coming down, but new barriers are emerging. And the unity that brought with it stronger negotiating position for creator, this has been eroded. The relationship within the creative sector are different today. The relationships between societies have changed. Today we have competition. There's competition between societies themselves, and there's also competition between traditional, I would say, societies who operate on a non-profit basis, and new societies, new for-profit commercial entities who are trying to enter the collective licensing landscape. And they all compete on attracting repertoire, on attracting the creators, and on issuing multi-territory licenses. Also, societies are no longer limited to their domestic territory. They are happily accepting creators who are not nationals or residents, and they are very happy to issue licenses that cover multiple territories. So we've moved from a domestic domain to a global domain when everyone is competing in one global market. And another new development is that we see in the market is that more and more companies, commercial entities that are operating for profit, they purchase complete catalogs and they enter the collective licensing field as the owners of rights. So the market today is much more diverse when it comes to licensing, and I would say to licensing entities themselves. But there are also other trends that we need to be aware of. The relationship between creators and users of content are changing. More and more distributors of creative content are becoming producers of the content, like Netflix, Apple, Amazon, and many others. And many times these digital platforms are trying to cut the societies out, and they're seeking direct relationship with the creators. And for example, one of the things that we see now is entities like Netflix offering to creators what we call buyout contracts, which effectively mean that the creators transfer all the rights to the platform and they're left with nothing or almost nothing. And this is another new development in the industry that probably came with the diminishing force of the collective. So unlike technologies, or unlike older or previous technologies, digital technologies have certainly triggered something new, something that we did not see before, and that is the structural changes to the relationships in our sector. The unity and the cooperation have been replaced to a large extent by a dynamic of competition. And this is why it's really different from what we've seen in the past. If in the past, new technologies brought creators together to face the power of those who use content and to deal with the imbalance of power, this is no longer the case. Digital technologies and the policies that have been adopted by decision makers to open up markets and to remove barriers to trade, they've actually led to an opposite reaction when it comes to the structures of the industry. They've changed relationships, they've increased competition, and as a result, they removed incentives to cooperate. They've also removed incentives to share information, an incentive that has always been there. And I think that the big question we need to ask ourselves in this context is what would be the long-term impact on the cultural landscape? I personally believe that this dynamic it's unlikely to benefit culture in the long run, and it's certainly unlikely to serve the smaller markets, the smaller creators, or the niche repertoire. I think that this new reality poses a risk to the ability of the smaller societies and smaller entities to protect domestic interests and to defend local creators and the local cultural scene. And I think that in the long run, and this could have detrimental consequences for cultural diversity. So I think that we see unintended consequences of these structural changes in the market that, one of these consequences could be that some of the, or even many of the small players will disappear. And if that happens, it could lead eventually to less cultural content and less cultural diversity. And this is something we need to be aware of. So that was on the theme of cooperation and on relationships. I would like to move to discuss data. That has become hugely important in the creative sector. I think that it's today important more than it ever was. Collective management of rights today relies on heavy processing of data about rights holders, data about the use of works. Until not too long ago, collective licensing was based on a blanket licensing. Information about the usage was significantly more limited. The granularity of data was not what it is today. We've never had such a massive amount of data associated with managing rights. And we've never had the same challenges of processing data. And author societies have never before found themselves in a situation where they need to invest so much and to dedicate so many resources to building the technology infrastructure or the technical capacity to process data in order to do their job. And also, in the past, the sharing of data was not really an issue. It was actually in everyone's interest. But today, data has become something that gives a competitive edge. It gives a competitive edge to those who have it over those who do not. Sharing data among societies and between societies and users, this is something that has been the cornerstone of the system of collective management of rights. But now, there's huge amounts of metadata, huge amounts of identifiers. There's a need to have strong processing power to deal with all this data. And this processing power depends on major investments that not everyone can make. So it is easy to see the advantage of those who have correct and massive amounts of data and have the capacity to deal with it compared with those who are not in this position. And because of the market characteristics today, and because of the competition between societies and other commercial entities who are in the business of licensing rights, those who have good, accurate, and reliable data, they have less and less incentives to share it with others. So the same competition that was thought would bring efficiencies is now, to some extent, is becoming a catalyst for inefficiency. So moving forward, I think there's no doubt that data will continue to be one of the most important assets in our sector. It's probably going to be, or already is, the most important asset after the content itself. And it will surely continue to expand, because what we witness today is that we've moved from collecting data about who owns what, or data about what was used and how much was used, to data about where from, how exactly the content was used, and even what happened afterwards. We are already at a stage where we are collecting data about what happens to you when you listen to music. And this is going to just become more and more extreme. Data about how you reacted when you listened to music or watched an audiovisual production. What was your behavior, your feelings? Did you turn the volume on? Did you switch to another channel? Maybe you put the headphones so that you can listen better. This information is already being collected. Did you go to Facebook to look for an old friend when you listen to a particular music track that it reminded you of someone from the past? When all of this data about us and how we experiment and use creative works, when all of this data, it will be used in combination with artificial intelligence, not only to recommend content to us, which is happening today, but also to create music or films that will match specifically our own taste. This is going to be the real turning point for the creative industries. And there are already some modern day philosophers like Yuval Noah Harari and others who talk about the role of the creator in a society where culture is created by others and not by individual human beings. But going back to our world and the data collected and used by collective management entities and by players in the market, when our smartphones will become just a little bit more smart, or just a little bit smarter than they are today, and they will identify how we feel and how we react to creative content, the data on ownership and the data on the use of creative works is going to become even more valuable, especially to advertisers, but also to others. And with that, there will be even less incentive to share this data, to share information about creative works. So this brings me to my conclusions, and I would like to conclude by circling back to where I started. I really believe that the real threat to the creative industries has never been new technology. The creative industries have always adapted to new technologies. The real challenge throughout history has always been about dealing with the commercial users or the new commercial users who appeared in the market following the arrival of new technologies. And these commercial users have always had the upper hand. The creative sector managed to remain resilient and was able to deal with this transformation to a new technology and to address the imbalance of power that was created because of the arrival of new technology, the imbalance of power with users. We've been able to address it through cooperation and through exchange of information. And collective management entities provided structures which were indispensable for this cooperation and for this exchange of information. And these are the structures that enable the creative sector to be resilient and adaptable at the same time. And because the creative sector was resilient and coordinated, the interests of protecting culture and protecting cultural diversity were maintained. And what was different with the arrival of digital is the type of competition that it triggered, and that regulators around the world have actually fueled and promoted. And this has quickly led to a new landscape. And I think it is a new landscape where there are reduced incentives to cooperate. And against this backdrop of reduced incentives to cooperate, we also saw the emergence of data as a key asset. And that data is an asset which gives a competitive advantage to those who have it. So moving forward, I think it's clear that creators will continue to face an imbalance in the bargaining power between them and the users of their works. We don't know what will be the next big technology that will arrive, but I think it's quite, we can expect that again, we will see an imbalance that will need to be addressed. And because of that, it is crucial to maintain efficient cooperation and efficient exchange of data in this sector. Because if the system is not working efficiently, and if there's no incentives to create, the price that we will pay as a society will be reflected in our culture. In the past 20 years or so, I think policy making has been mostly focused on opening markets, on removing barriers, on promoting competition, and these are all important things. They're very important and very valuable things, but I think that in the process, we may have forgotten the importance of protecting our culture, and it may be the right moment to have a fresh look at that. And with that, I will finish. Thank you.
Gadi, thank you very much for your for this excellent talk. you generously shared with us your thoughts and concerns and predictions, and I'm sure the audience will be highly appreciative of that. With your permission, I will turn to a number of questions that I have to you in relation both to your talks, but also more in general for you as an expert in the field. And then we'll move on to a number. I mean, we have a very large number of questions by the audience. So apologies to those of you whose questions I will not pose to Gadi, but I have selected a few that I intend to pose to you in a short while. Now, starting, it is difficult really not to start by asking about the situation in your sector today and how creators are coping with the lockdown. Are there any estimations about how much the industry is losing or conversely actually gaining? I mean, at a certain level, one may ask, people stay at home. At home, they consume more entertainment products. So what's your view, your take on the situation as we stand?
Okay, well, it's difficult to be very precise, but I think that the industry is already preparing for a devastating impact on its performance. I mean, many of the activities have stopped, and certainly when we listen to what the societies around the world say that they estimate, we look about, I think on average, between 20 and 40% drop in collections on behalf of creators, because, well, I think that the creative sector is one of the sectors that was really strongly hit by this situation. Many activities that creators rely on stopped, live concerts, music played in pubs or restaurants. Also outside the music sector, there's no cinemas, no exhibitions, so visual artists are impacted. And it's true that some activities you might think they became more popular and maybe they will make up for this decline in other sectors, and maybe things like broadcasting or online streaming will offset or will balance the drop in other areas. But there are many question marks around that, and maybe I will explain a little bit. So, for example, for authors, one of the main sources of income is income from TV and radio broadcasting. But most of the licensing deals to license creative content to broadcasters are based on advertising revenue. So the royalties are a direct reflection of the advertising income of these commercial users. And as far as I know, and I think many already speak about it, advertising dropped also during this period because less businesses advertise their products in an economic crisis. There's also a big question mark about the streaming sector. And again, it's early days, so it's very difficult to provide accurate information. But for the first question that we can ask about streaming is whether more people actually became paying subscribers or not. We don't have the figures. And if they did, how long will they remain as paying subscribers? Because if there is economic pressure and if there's a financial pressure on consumers, I think that we can assume that even if for 1 or 2 or 3 months they started paying Netflix or others, maybe they will stop that and they will direct their resources to more essential spending if there is financial pressure. And that relates to the paying subscription. But of course, the majority of subscribers, for example, especially for the music streaming services, are on the freemium models. And there's no more income. It's just that what is paid will be probably split into smaller pieces, I would say, and be shared with more creators. So overall, we expect a major decline. How much, we don't know, and how much will be offset by an increase in some other forms or digital forms, it's still too early to say, but I don't think it will offset the drop.
Okay, thank you. My next question refers to one of the points that you made in your presentation regarding the the EU and your efforts in relation to platforms last year. You mentioned those big digital platforms, and as you alluded to, last year there was a major lobbying battle between the creative industries, a part of which you represented, and shall I say platforms in plural, or one platform in particular, about the new EU directive. Now, how significant was the outcome, which was in your favor? And so first, and connects to the certain take on that, and do you think it would actually, not on paper, but in reality, really change things?
Okay, so it was very significant for two reasons. First of all, because of the substance of what has been achieved. I think that what was achieved there was to create a sort of a level playing field, or essentially we made sure that the legal framework puts all of the digital services at the same level. For a long time, certain specific services that rely on content being uploaded by the users, like Spotify, like YouTube, they've claimed the protection of safe harbors. They've claimed that they are only hosting and therefore they should not be liable. And I think that by removing this argument and by clarifying that they need to obtain a license, we've actually achieved something very, very significant, because all of the users, whether they are services like Spotify, who take care of their own platform and upload everything themselves, or whether it's YouTube, Dailymotion, and others, they will all need to come to the negotiating table in the same way. No one will have an advantage. I think that it's fair to the creators, and it's also fair as between digital services, that everyone will be in the same position and they will all need to negotiate licenses in the same way. That was significant, but much beyond that, I think that there was a very, very long period where the creative sector has not been able to promote pro-copyright legislation. I think that for more than 20 years, this sector faced a huge difficulty when it came to lobbying and to achieving favorable legislation. And the EU directive did that. After a long time, I think actually that looking at how the technology sector approached this lobbying, how they lobbied, how they went about their actions to derail the process and to stop it from happening, I don't think that they, for a second, they've even imagined this could happen, that they could lose, and that actually the creative sector will obtain something that will make the sector much stronger. So in that sense, it was a huge achievement.
I agree, especially with the last point. I think from their perspective, at the beginning, they underestimated the threat that comes from this initiative. And I think that when they figured, it looks to me that when they realized that it's a very real challenge, it was fairly late in the process. I'm talking now about strategy and tactics, but that's maybe for another time. Right, you mentioned, I mean, I personally am interested in data and new technology, both from the creative industries and from others in other contexts. And you mentioned there data and the fact that the more valuable it becomes, the more problematic it is in terms of sharing it, both in terms of incentives and maybe otherwise. Do you think, and that's the risk of again using and reusing this buzzword, do you think that blockchain technology may address this problem, at least partially? And if so, are there any initiatives that you are either involved or aware of around that issue?
Right. So it was said before me, I think that that blockchain is the perfect solution to the problem you didn't know you have. Mm-hmm. I will say, look, I'm not saying there are no problems. There's lots of problems with data exchanges in the creative sector generally, the music sector and others. But I think that the technologies that we have today are sufficient to deal with them. The problem is not about the nature of the technology. The problem is the use of technology. So to explain a bit more, I think that the first challenge that you see, if you take the music industry, for example, the first challenge is actually getting the information in. So when a song is written or when it's published by a music publisher and by a record company, it's marketed by a record company, it needs to be registered. The information needs to be registered. The information about the authors of the composition, they need to be registered with the society. And the society needs to know who created the work, if there were many creators, how do they split the ownership between them, who should be paid. All of these things, you attach metadata to them. But if the information does not come in, then you cannot attach the metadata. And that's one of the key things that are happening today. The information either does not arrive or it arrives but only partially. And this is something that's very important. I don't think that you necessarily need blockchain to solve that. You can solve it with existing technologies. And then you have the information that's coming from the platforms, the digital platforms. Many times the information that they provide about the use is incomplete, and therefore you cannot do accurate distributions to the rights holders. Related to that, you have a problem that you have different metadata by different sectors. And I think I try to touch on this issue in my presentation without going into too much detail. But for example, there are metadata that is attached to, or identifiers that is attached to the recordings. And there's a different identifier that is attached to musical compositions. When digital platforms report about what was streamed, they report about the recordings. They don't always report about the composition. So how do you get them to report with a more complete information? Or how do you link between the information that relates to the recording industry and the information that relates to the publishing industry? So I'm not sure you need blockchain. I think you can solve a lot of these problems without blockchain, just using other technologies. There is actually at least one initiative to link different identifiers, and this initiative is based on blockchain. But again, I personally think that there is so much that we can still do and so much that can be improved using existing technologies, but using them more before you resort to blockchain as the solution.
Okay, thank you. So I take the point that in general, you don't have to go to technologies like blockchain in order to achieve these objectives. But I know, and I don't know if I should mention specific jurisdictions to be on the safe side. I won't. There have been some problems with mismanagement in certain jurisdictions, also in terms of transparency. One wonders whether in such instances it could be of particular benefit.
Well, I think, again, without mentioning specific countries, but we are not hiding the fact that there are some problems. There always are, and we always try to solve them, and we're very active in trying to solve them. But again, I'm not sure that the technology will solve them. The problems you refer to are problems about the management of money coming in, the management, how you send out the money. Having more data will not necessarily solve these problems. I think that we're talking about two different things. There should be one effort to improve data generally by rights holders and by the users of content, and there should be other efforts to address any issues with the management of rights and the management of royalties, and we are trying to work on both ways at CISAC. But again, I think these are related issues. I'm not sure if blockchain will necessarily solve governance issues at societies or management of rights.
I will, since I'm going to drop my questions here and move to a couple of questions from the audience. There is a question here that refers, direct you to the role of the CMOs in light of the current struggles of the creative industries in relation to live events. The question refers to efforts of domestic CMOs in establishing hardship funds for their members, and the role of CMOs in national levels that seeks to support and promote the reopening of live music venues. You emphasize the digital issue, the digital challenge, the digital context, but what is the link from the CISAC perspective with the significance, not respecting of anything digital, with live music and live events overall?
Yeah, so first of all, it is very significant. I mentioned earlier, radio and TV as the key source of income. So that's the main category. The second one is live, and digital is only third. So the live sector is a hugely important one and a very important source of income. And the fact that there are no live concerts now is a major problem, and will account for the lion's share of the decline, I think, that we will see. So how we address it, I think that's actually a good example to show the power of the collective, because one of the first things that we did as a confederation is actually to bring all of the creators and the societies together around a global campaign. So we mobilized the creative community around the campaign that we called Resiliart. It's something that we launched with UNESCO. And the idea was to remind decision makers that they need to pay particular attention to this sector, because the creators are vulnerable and the sector is fragile. And we wanted decision makers to understand that they need to pay attention to this sector when they start building and developing all of these rescue packages and emergency funds that they were working on. We wanted them to, I would say, develop sort of like kick-off strategies to come out of this crisis, paying particular attention to the creative sector, and we did it together. We organized panels with many creators. We brought very famous creators to speak to decision makers. There was a panel online. Later, there was an event with more than 140 ministers of culture from around the world who listened to creators and understood that this is something that is actually in everyone's interest to support this sector during this time of crisis, and to make sure that people can continue will stay in the sector and will help it through the recovery.
Okay, thank you, Gadi, and I will move on to the last question, which focuses in particular about an Indian experience. I must say, I personally not familiar with that, but I assume you probably are. And the question reads like this: in recent times in India, there is a development where, apart from collecting societies, authors and owners of works are licensing or signing their works to an agent who is not a collecting society, and that agent enforces issues or licenses against third parties. What is your opinion, Gadi, on issuing licenses and enforcement through this agent? Does it not further create another layer which is detrimental to the collecting society systems and complicates the system for the public and third parties who need to seek those licenses?
Right. So I think, again, that it goes back to the main theme of my presentation, which is the value of cooperation and collective strength. I personally don't believe that we should be telling creators what is good for them. If a creator, an author, believes that what is good for them economically or for any other reason, it's good for them to sign a contract where they give away all the rights and someone else will become the owner and enforce them. It's up to these creators. I think that our role as societies, as an international organization, is to make sure that these creators are aware of what they're doing. They are aware of their legal rights. They understand the consequences of contracts or any assignments that they sign. And I don't think that it is our responsibility to intervene in the market. I think that we should let the market do what it has to do. And if what is happening in the market is that we see more and more new forms of collective licensing, that's fine. If it happens, it means that there is demand for that, or that it makes sense. What we should be careful of is not to erode and not to erode the collective, not to make sure that there's always a structure there that will allow creators to coordinate and to cooperate and to join forces. Because if these structures will not exist, the creators will be much weaker. And I think, again, the interest of society is in creative activity, and the interest of society in having more activity in the cultural sector, both for the economic reasons, but also for the cultural reasons. This interest will be diminished. And this is something we need to be aware of.
Thank you, Gadi. I think, if I'm not mistaken, yeah, this is 3:30. We arrived to the end of today's event. And I will take this opportunity to say, Gadi, again, thank you so much for this fantastic talk and for sharing with us your thoughts and insights. I'm sure that if we were not in a digital mode, we would have had a noisy appreciation in the form of applause from the audience. Of course, thank you all for participating and taking part in this event. We hope to have many more, but this one specifically dedicated for the 40 years anniversary of CCLS. So yeah, happy birthday CCLS. Thank you all.
Thank you, Noam, and thank you, Gadi, and thank you all the participants for coming today. Keep safe and keep in touch. Goodbye.
Thank you, Duncan. Thanks, Noam. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.